November 25th, 1963. Outside St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, D.C., the most famous photograph in American history is about to be taken. A little boy in a pale coat steps forward and raises his hand in a salute to his father's passing casket. John Kennedy Jr., 3 years old that very day. The image will run in every newspaper on earth and become the permanent picture of a nation's grief. Look at the adults gathered behind that child. Jacqueline Kennedy, veiled in black, Robert Kennedy, Edward Kennedy, the whole clan, drawn together at the center of the century's most public mourning. And standing right there, between Ted Kennedy and Jackie, is a tall, handsome English actor named Peter Lawford. He is inside the circle. In the photograph that defines the family forever, he is one of them, close enough to touch the widow, part of the wall of Kennedys around that saluting child. Now here is what you need to understand. That is very nearly the last time Peter Lawford is ever allowed to stand there. Within a few years, the man in that photograph will be gone from this family completely, not divorced quietly and remembered fondly, erased, cut off, written out of the story so thoroughly that when he dies, 21 years later, on Christmas Eve alone, the family he married into will be almost entirely absent. And there will be a fight over who pays for his funeral, and in the end, his ashes will not even stay in the ground. His name was Peter Lawford. He married a Kennedy. He became the president's brother-in-law. He was the single most important bridge between Washington power and Hollywood glamour in the 20th century, and the family he served destroyed him. The easy version of this story is that he got divorced and drifted away. That is not what happened. What happened was a banishment, deliberate and total. And it did not begin with the divorce. It began earlier, and it had specific causes, and almost none of them were things Peter Lawford actually did. So what did he do? Why would the most powerful family in America take a man from the inside of that funeral photograph and cast him out so completely that he died a stranger to them? Was it the drinking? Was it the divorce? Was it Marilyn Monroe? Or was it something colder? Something about what a family like this does with a person once he has stopped being useful and started being dangerous. Before we go back to the beginning, hold on to a few things, because each one is a thread that runs straight into the answer. He married into this family over the direct objection of its patriarch, and he had to change his religion to do it. He was the single most important link between the Kennedys and Hollywood, and that link is the entire reason they tolerated him. In one weekend in 1962, he was made to deliver a message that destroyed his own career for a decision he had no part in making. And on the last night of Marilyn Monroe's life, his was one of the last voices she ever heard. Keep those four in mind. Each one is a reason, and together they are the whole story. Stay with me, because the real reason Peter Lawford was banished from the Kennedy family is not a single betrayal. It is four separate things stacked on top of each other, and by the time you understand all four, you will see that his exile was not an accident of a failed marriage. It was a decision. To understand the banishment, you first have to understand how precarious his place in this family was from the very beginning. He was never fully one of them. He was allowed in, and being allowed in is a different thing from belonging. Peter Sidney. Ernest Lawford was born in London on September 7, 1923, and the circumstances of his birth were the first secret of a life that would be full of them. His father was Sir Sidney Lawford, a distinguished, decorated British Army general, a knight of the realm. His mother was a woman named May. And when Peter was conceived, the two of them were married, but not to each other. Both were married to other people. There were 2 divorces and then a marriage, and Peter arrived in the middle of that scandal, a fact that trailed the family quietly for years. His mother, who became Lady Lawford, was by nearly every account a difficult and wounding woman, a snob who said cruel things about her own son in public, and whose relationship with him was poisoned for most of his life. He was raised without roots, moving around Europe, educated by tutors rather than in schools, spending far more time around adults than around children. It produced exactly the kind of man you would expect. Charming, socially fluid, comfortable anywhere and belonging nowhere. Then, at 14, an accident redirected his entire future. He put his arm through a glass door and did permanent damage to it. The injury left the arm partially crippled for life, and it later made him ineligible to serve in the Second World War. For the son of a British general, in wartime Britain, being unable to fight was a private humiliation he carried quietly. That wound matters more than it might seem, because it set the template for the man. Peter Lawford grew up unable to be the thing his father was, the soldier, the man of substance and duty. What he could be instead was charming. He learned early that if you cannot earn a place through achievement, you can earn one through likability, through being wanted in the room rather than needed for the work. It is a survival strategy, and it works, but it produces a particular kind of person, one whose entire security depends on the goodwill of others, and who has no fortress of his own to retreat to when that goodwill is withdrawn. Everything that happened to Peter Lawford at the hands of the Kennedys was, in a sense, written in that 14-year-old boy who could no longer be a soldier and decided to be liked instead. So he became an actor. He signed with the great studio, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, and he had a real career through the 1940s. He was handsome, he was English, he had the accent and the manners, and the studio knew how to use all of it. But here is the thing that everyone who worked with him observed, and it is the key to his whole life. Peter Lawford was not a great actor and did not try to be one. What he was likable, enormously, effortlessly likable. He was the man you wanted at your party, the man who made a room easier. He built his entire life on that single quality, and a life built on being liked works beautifully right up until the moment the people in charge decide to stop liking you. He entered the Kennedy world through a fairly conventional door. He met Patricia Kennedy, the sixth of the 9 Kennedy children, the tall, quiet, sophisticated daughter who had wanted to work in film production herself. They knew each other for years before it became serious, and when it did, her father, Joseph P. Kennedy, was against it, firmly and on multiple grounds. To understand the objections and everything that follows, you have to understand the machine Peter was marrying into. The Kennedys were not a warm, sprawling clan held together by sentiment, whatever the photographs suggested. They were an enterprise. Joseph Kennedy had built the family the way he built his fortune, as a project with a goal, and the goal was power. Every marriage was assessed for what it added to the enterprise. Every relationship was, at some level, a transaction. His daughter's husbands were expected to be assets, men who strengthened the name and served the mission. Eunice had married Sergeant Shriver, a serious Catholic man with a real political future who would go on to build the Peace Corps and run for vice president. Jean would marry Stephen Smith, who would run the family's money and its campaigns. Those were useful marriages, and they were rewarded with a permanent place inside the machine. Peter Lawford brought nothing the machine needed. That is the cold fact underneath Joe Kennedy's objections, and it is the cold fact that would eventually justify the banishment. In a family that kept people for what they contributed, Peter contributed glamour and nothing more, and glamour, unlike money or votes or Catholic respectability, can evaporate overnight. Understand the objections, because they tell you exactly how the family saw Peter Lawford from day one. Joe Kennedy did not want his daughter marrying an actor, and he held that view with authority because he had made a fortune in Hollywood himself and knew precisely what actors were. He did not want her marrying a British subject who brought nothing to an American political dynasty, and he did not want her marrying a non-Catholic. There is a story, possibly embellished but revealing, that Joe Kennedy said he would rather his daughter marry almost anyone than an actor, and there was a period where he was reported to have said something even harsher about the match. The religious problem was solved the way it had to be. Peter converted to Catholicism. Whether the conversion meant anything to him is a question no one can honestly answer. It cleared the obstacle, and on April 24, 1954, Peter Lawford married Patricia Kennedy at the Church of St. Thomas More in Manhattan, with thousands of onlookers pressing against police barricades outside. So he was in. But look at how he got in. He married in over the objection of the patriarch. He converted to qualify. He arrived as a man the head of the family had not wanted, tolerated because his daughter insisted. That is not the foundation of a secure place in a dynasty. That is a probation, and Peter Lawford would spend the next decade on it, never quite realizing that his membership could be revoked. Now, for a while, he did the one thing that made him genuinely valuable. And this is the second thing you have to understand, because his usefulness is the whole reason he was tolerated, and the loss of it is the whole reason he was discarded. Peter Lawford became the bridge. He was the connective tissue between two Americas that did not otherwise touch. On one side, the Kennedys, ascending toward the presidency, the embodiment of American political power. On the other, Hollywood, and specifically the most glamorous social force in mid-century entertainment, Frank Sinatra, and the group the press called the Rat Pack. Sinatra was a passionate Kennedy supporter, and Lawford was his direct line into the family. Sinatra even had a nickname for him that tells you everything about the nature of the relationship. He called him Brother-in-Lawford. It was affectionate, and it was also a precise description of what Peter was for. He was the brother-in-law, the access point, the door. Through Peter, Hollywood money and Hollywood star power flowed toward the Kennedy campaign. Through Peter, the thrilling proximity to a future president flowed back toward Sinatra and his circle. In the 1960 campaign, this mattered enormously. The Kennedys understood the power of celebrity before almost anyone else in politics, and Peter Lawford was their instrument for harnessing it. He connected the candidate to a world of entertainers, fundraisers, and glamour that made Jack Kennedy seem not just like a politician, but like the most exciting man in America. And when Kennedy won, Peter's house became part of the story. The Lawford Beach House in Santa Monica, right on the Pacific, became the place the president stayed when he came to California. People called it the Western White House. Peter Lawford, the man whose only real gift was making people comfortable, was now making the most powerful man in the world comfortable in his own home by the ocean. At the peak around 1961, Peter Lawford had it all. He was inside the most glamorous family in America and inside the most glamorous social set in Hollywood, and he was the hinge between them. He was necessary to both, and a man who is necessary feels safe. It is worth pausing on how intoxicating this must have been, because the height of the fall is what makes the fall a tragedy rather than just a misfortune. For a brief span at the start of the 60s, Peter Lawford occupied a position almost no one in American life has ever held. He could pick up a telephone and reach the President of the United States, who was his wife's brother. He could pick up the same telephone and reach Frank Sinatra, the most famous entertainer alive, who called him brother and wanted him at every table. He hosted the leader of the free world in his living room by the sea. Movie stars and senators passed through his door. He was, for that short moment, one of the most socially powerful men in the country, and all of it rested on the simplest possible foundation, which was that important people enjoyed his company and found him useful. He should not have felt safe, because a bridge has no value of its own. Its worth depends entirely on the two things it connects still wanting to reach each other. The moment they don't, the bridge is just an obstacle in the water. Peter Lawford never understood that about himself. The Kennedys understood it perfectly. And then, in a single weekend in March of 1962, the whole structure came down, and the destruction of Peter Lawford truly began. This is the third thing, and it is the one that is most unfair, because what happened to him here was almost entirely not his fault. The president was planning a trip to Southern California, and Peter, doing exactly what he existed to do, arranged for Kennedy to stay at Frank Sinatra's estate in Palm Springs. For Sinatra, this was the summit of a lifetime. The President of the United States, his friend, staying under his roof. Sinatra spent freely to prepare. He built a helicopter pad so the president could land on the property. He constructed accommodations for the Secret Service. By some accounts, he put up a flagpole for the presidential flag and remodeled parts of his home. He poured himself into it. Then Robert Kennedy intervened and everything collapsed. Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General, and he was running the most aggressive campaign against organized crime in American history. And Frank Sinatra had documented friendships with organized crime figures, most notably Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago outfit. For the President of the United States to sleep under Sinatra's roof while his own brother was prosecuting the mafia was politically and legally impossible. Bobby saw it immediately and killed the plan. The president would not stay with Sinatra. Instead, he stayed at the home of Bing Crosby, who was, in an added insult, a Republican. Someone had to tell Frank Sinatra. And the family did not send Jack. They did not send Bobby, who had actually made the decision. They sent Peter Lawford. Think about the cruelty of that arrangement, whether it was intended or simply careless. The decision was made by the Kennedys, for Kennedy reasons, to protect Kennedy interests. And the person dispatched to absorb Sinatra's rage was the one member of the circle with the least power and the most to lose. Peter was made the messenger of a decision he had no part in. Sinatra's reaction was volcanic. By the accounts that have come down, he took a sledgehammer to the helipad he had built. He tore up photographs, and he turned the full force of his fury on Peter Lawford, and he never turned it off. Sinatra cut him dead. He never spoke to him again in any meaningful way for the rest of their lives. He had Lawford removed from the next Rat Pack film, Robin and the Seven Hoods, and replaced him, in a stroke of deliberate humiliation, with Bing Crosby, the very man who had hosted the president, instead. Years later, when Lawford tried to attend a Sinatra performance in Las Vegas, hoping to make peace, Sinatra reportedly refused to go on stage until Lawford had been physically escorted out of the room. Understand what this did to Peter Lawford's actual livelihood. His career was not built on talent that could survive alone. It was built on access, on friendship, on being one of the boys. Sinatra was the center of that world, and Sinatra had just expelled him from it and made sure everyone knew. Overnight, Peter Lawford went from being the connector at the heart of Hollywood's most powerful clique to being a man that the most powerful man in that clique had publicly destroyed. In Hollywood, which watches these things with predatory attention, the meaning was instantly clear. Peter Lawford was finished as an insider, and notice the shape of it. The blow that ruined him came from his own family. Bobby made the call. Jack accepted it. Peter paid for it, completely and permanently, on their behalf. He was the one who bled, so that the Kennedys would not have to. That is the moment his value began to collapse. He had been the bridge to Sinatra. Now Sinatra despised him. The bridge no longer reached the other shore. And a family as coldly practical as the Kennedys keeps very careful accounts of who is still useful. But the Sinatra disaster, as damaging as it was, is not the darkest chapter. That comes a few months later, in August of 1962, and it involves the one association that would cling to Peter Lawford for the rest of his life and follow him into his grave. Marilyn Monroe. And here, I have to be very careful with you, because this is the exact point where documented history and 60 years of feverish speculation become almost impossible to separate, and I would rather give you the honest version than the sensational one. Here is what is genuinely established. Peter Lawford knew Marilyn Monroe. She was a guest at his beach house. He moved in the social space where the private lives of the Kennedys and the world of Hollywood overlapped, and he functioned there, as he functioned everywhere, as a facilitator, a host, a connector. It was Lawford who arranged for Monroe to perform at the famous birthday celebration for the president at Madison Square Garden in May of 1962, the night she sang Happy Birthday in that breathless, unforgettable way that welded her forever to the Kennedy legend in the public mind. And here is the part that is documented and genuinely haunting. On the night Marilyn Monroe died, August 4th, 1962, Peter Lawford was one of the last people to speak to her. He telephoned her, by his own account, to invite her to dinner. What he heard on the line alarmed him. Her voice was faint, slurred, fading. By his recollection, she said something like, "Say goodbye to Pat, say goodbye to the president, and say goodbye to yourself, because you're a nice guy." And then the line went quiet. What Peter Lawford did, and did not do, in the hours after that phone call has been debated ever since, and I want to mark clearly where the solid ground ends. He was alarmed. He wanted to go to her house. By several accounts, he was talked out of going directly himself, and there are claims that he or others went to the house before the death was made public. Around all of this has grown an enormous structure of conspiracy. Claims that Lawford cleaned the scene, removed a diary, destroyed evidence, protected the Kennedys from exposure. Weigh that carefully. A great deal of the most lurid material traces back to sources that are unreliable, to books written for profit, and to Lawford himself in the last years of his life, when he was ill, broke, and selling stories to anyone who would pay. Some of it comes from his final wife's later collaboration with an author. None of the darkest claims has ever been proven, and the official investigations, including a review 2 decades later, did not overturn the finding that Monroe died of an overdose. But for the story of Peter Lawford's banishment, the truth or falsehood of the conspiracy theories almost does not matter. What matters is the position he was now in. He was publicly, permanently attached to the death of Marilyn Monroe. He was the last man she spoke to. He was tangled, fairly or not, in the swirl of rumor connecting her death to the Kennedys, and that made him something far more dangerous to the family than a mere fading actor. There is a human dimension to this that the conspiracy noise tends to bury, and it is worth surfacing because it tells you something about the man the family threw away. By multiple accounts, Peter Lawford was genuinely, lastingly wounded by Marilyn Monroe's death. He appears to have blamed himself, not for any crime, but for the ordinary human failure of not going to her that night, of being talked out of it, of not doing more. People who knew him said he carried that guilt for the rest of his life. And there is a small, telling detail from the funeral. When Joe DiMaggio, Monroe's grieving ex-husband, arranged her burial, he banned the Hollywood crowd, the Kennedys, and the Rat Pack, Peter among them. Lawford, who had genuinely cared for her, was not permitted to say goodbye. He was hurt by it, and he said so. Hold that image next to what the Kennedys were about to do to him, because it rhymes. Twice now, at Monroe's grave and soon at the edge of his own family, Peter Lawford would be a man who cared, standing outside a door that had been closed in his face. It made him a liability. It made him a man who knew things, or was believed to know things, and whose name could not be spoken without dragging the Kennedy name toward the ugliest scandal imaginable. Sit with what Peter Lawford had become by the end of 1962. He had lost his usefulness because Sinatra had expelled him, and he had acquired a danger because Marilyn Monroe had died with him on the other end of the phone. He was no longer an asset. He was a risk, and that combination, for this family, is fatal. He held on for a little while longer because Jack was still alive and still president, and as long as there was a Kennedy in the White House, Peter's marriage to Pat still had a structural reason to exist. He was still, technically, the president's brother-in-law. He was still standing in the funeral photograph. And then Dallas took the last thing holding him in place. November 22, 1963, ended more than a presidency. For Peter Lawford personally, it removed the final reason the Kennedys had to keep him. His entire worth to the family had been as the glamorous connector to a world made important by the fact that a Kennedy sat in the White House. With Jack dead, the White House was gone. The access meant nothing. The bridge led nowhere at all now. What remained was a man with a serious and worsening drinking problem, a wrecked Hollywood career, a poisonous history with Sinatra, and a permanent radioactive association with the death of Marilyn Monroe. There was nothing left to keep, and the marriage that had been the only thing binding him to the family began its final collapse. His drinking, already heavy, grew worse and pulled in other substances. Pat Kennedy, who had watched her mother endure decades of a difficult marriage in silence, as Catholic doctrine demanded, reached the end of what she was willing to endure. The couple separated, and in 1966, the divorce was finalized. That divorce was Peter Lawford's formal severance from the Kennedy family. But do not mistake the divorce for the cause of the banishment. The banishment was already well underway. The divorce simply made official what had been building since the Sinatra weekend in 1962. It cut the last thread. Pat took the 4 children to New York and rebuilt her life. Peter was left on the far side of the water, the bridge to nowhere, and the family closed the door. And once that door was closed, it stayed closed. And the completeness of the closing is the thing that turns this from a sad divorce into a genuine banishment. Now, let me pull the 4 threads together, because this is the real answer to the question we started with. Peter Lawford was not banished for one reason. He was banished because 4 separate things happened to him, and the family's response to each one was the same cold arithmetic. The first reason is that he was never truly one of them to begin with. He came in on probation, over Joe Kennedy's objection, an actor, a foreigner, a convert. A family that admits you conditionally can expel you conditionally. He had no deep roots to protect him when the winds turned. The second reason is that his entire value was as a bridge, and bridges are only valuable while both sides want to cross. When Sinatra turned on him and when Dallas removed the president, both shores fell away, and a bridge to nowhere is not kept. It is abandoned. The third reason is the Sinatra catastrophe itself, which is the cruelest thread because there he was punished for a decision the Kennedys made and forced him to deliver. They spent his relationship with the most powerful man in Hollywood to protect themselves, and having spent it, they had less reason than ever to keep the man they had spent it on. And the fourth reason, the darkest, is Marilyn Monroe. After that night, Peter Lawford was not merely useless. He was dangerous. He was a man permanently linked to a death that brushed against the family. A man who knew too much, or was believed to. A name that could not be spoken safely. A family built on the management of its own image does not merely discard such a man. It puts distance between itself and him, deliberately and permanently, because his very existence is a threat to the story. Put those four together, and you do not have a man who drifted away after a divorce. You have a man who was systematically removed. Unwanted at the start, useless in the middle, dangerous at the end. The Kennedys did what the Kennedys always did with such a problem. They closed ranks, and they left him outside the ranks, and they went on telling their story without him in it. And notice the quiet efficiency of it, because that is the truly chilling part. There was never a confrontation. There was no dramatic scene in which the family gathered to cast Peter Lawford out. No letter, no declaration. That is not how a machine like this operates. The banishment was accomplished through absence, through phone calls not returned, through invitations that stopped arriving, through a name that simply stopped being mentioned. He was not thrown out of a door. The door was quietly walled over while he stood on the other side of it, until one day he looked up and realized there was no longer any way back in, and never had been. Not really. A family that admits you conditionally does not need to expel you loudly. It simply withdraws the conditions one by one until there is nothing left holding you inside. That is the cruelty specific to this kind of power. Open cruelty can at least be answered. You can rage against a slammed door, but you cannot argue with an absence. You cannot demand to be let back into a room that everyone politely pretends was never yours to begin with. Peter Lawford spent his last 2 decades reaching for people who had simply stopped reaching back, and the not reaching was the whole punishment. The years that followed were a long, sad confirmation of the exile. Peter Lawford's career shrank to television guest spots and game shows and small parts, anything to stay visible. He married 3 more times, each marriage shorter and sadder than the last. His health collapsed under the weight of decades of alcohol and drugs. In his final years, broke and ill, he did the thing that a man with nothing left to sell does. He sold his stories. He gave interviews about the Kennedys and about Marilyn that grew steadily more lurid as his desperation grew, which is precisely why the material from those years is so unreliable, and precisely why it is also so sad. He was cashing in the only currency the family had left him, which was his proximity to their secrets. There is a detail from those wilderness years that captures the completeness of the exile better than any argument. When one of Frank Sinatra's own family members was in crisis, Sinatra, who had sworn never to speak to Lawford again, reportedly reached out to him anyway, because in a genuine emergency, Peter was still the man you called. Even the man who had destroyed him knew, somewhere, that Lawford was fundamentally decent and dependable. The tragedy is that this knowledge never translated into rescue. People used him when they needed him and dropped him when they didn't. Over and over, and the pattern that had defined his whole life, the man valued only for his usefulness, held right to the end. He died on Christmas Eve, December 24, 1984, in Los Angeles. He was 61 years old. His body had been destroyed by years of substance abuse, his liver and kidneys failing. He died largely estranged from the glittering worlds he had once connected, a long way from the man who stood in the funeral photograph between Ted Kennedy and Jackie. And then came the final indignity, the one that says everything about how complete the banishment was. His funeral expenses were not settled. His last wife would later state publicly that his children, his own children by Patricia Kennedy, the grandchildren of Joseph P. Kennedy, would not pay. Whatever the private truth of that dispute, the outcome is a matter of record. Some years after his burial at Westwood Village Memorial Park, the cemetery where Marilyn Monroe herself lies, the plot was not paid for. His remains were removed, and his ashes were scattered at sea off the coast of California. Think about the shape of that ending against the shape of the beginning. He started inside the most famous photograph in America, one of the Kennedys, close enough to touch the grieving widow. He ended as ashes on the water, unable to remain in his own grave, cast out even from the ground by a family that had decided, years before, that he was no longer one of them, and perhaps never really had been. Now let me be straight with you about the sources, because this is a story that sits right next to the most mythologized events of the century, and it is very easy to slide from fact into fantasy. The solid ground is real, and it is enough. The marriage, the conversion, Joe Kennedy's objections, the role as bridge to Sinatra, the Palm Springs disaster of 1962, Sinatra's permanent break, the removal from the film, the divorce in 1966, the ruined final years, the death on Christmas Eve, and the scattering of his ashes after the funeral bill went unpaid. All of that is documented in the standard biography of Lawford by James Spada, in the histories of the Kennedy family and the Rat Pack, and in contemporary reporting. The quicksand is everything in the deepest part of the Marilyn Monroe story. What Lawford did in the hours after that phone call, what he knew, whether he cleaned a scene or removed anything, whether there was any cover-up at all, those claims range from the plausible to the wild. They draw heavily on unreliable and financially motivated sources, including Lawford himself when he was desperate, and they have never been proven. An honest account tells you that Lawford's proximity to Monroe's death is documented, and that the vast architecture of conspiracy built on top of that proximity is not. And here is the thing that honest handling reveals, which is more interesting than the conspiracy anyway. You do not need any of the dark theories to explain the banishment. The 4 documented reasons are entirely sufficient on their own. He was an outsider admitted on probation, his usefulness collapsed, he was made to take the fall for the Sinatra break, and he became a liability the family needed to distance itself from. Whether or not he ever cleaned a single thing in Marilyn Monroe's house, the association alone was enough to make him radioactive. The plain facts explain the exile completely. So go back one last time to that photograph outside St. Matthew's Cathedral in November of 1963. The saluting boy, the veiled widow, the wall of Kennedys, and the tall English actor standing among them inside the circle, one of the family in the eyes of the whole world. He did not know it yet, standing there in the cold, but he was already most of the way out. Sinatra had already destroyed him. Marilyn was already a year in her grave, with his name attached to her last night alive. His usefulness was already spent. The only thing still holding him inside that circle was the marriage, and the marriage would be gone within 3 years. Peter Lawford's real crime was not any single thing he did. His real crime was that he stopped being useful and started being dangerous in a family that measured every human being by exactly those 2 things. He gave them Hollywood, he gave them Sinatra, he gave them his home for their president, and when the giving was done and the risk remained, they gave him nothing back. Not a place at the end, not help when he was dying, not even the dignity of a grave. There is one more way to see it, and it may be the truest. Peter Lawford was a mirror. He reflected back whatever was around him, glamour when there was glamour, power when there was power, and that made him irresistible when the Kennedys were rising and disposable the moment reflecting them became a risk. A mirror is useful only as long as you like what it shows. The instant it starts to show the scandal, the mob ties, the dead actress, the ugliness underneath the Camelot image, you turn it to the wall. That is what they did to him. They turned him to the wall, and eventually they carried him out of the house entirely and scattered him where no reflection could ever come back. They took him from the center of that photograph and they scattered him on the sea, and they went on being the Kennedys. That is the real reason Peter Lawford was banished, not because of what he did, because of what he became, to a family that keeps only what it can use and buries or scatters everything else.